Good evening, everyone. We are in the midst of our review of the totality of Shabbos. After going through various halachas, we're by Shabbos morning, and we're in the midst of the Siddur of Shabbos morning. And let's get straight to the Haftara. The Haftara is a very mysterious element of Shabbos and of Yom Tov. It's a feature really of many special days. I'm sure I made this comment before. It's so interesting to me, and I say this to you, I say this to conservative rabbis. I had chavrusas. One chavrusa was a conservative rabbi. I said this to him. It's so interesting what halachos they keep and what they disregard. Haftara is such a mystery as to why we do it, but that they keep. Kashrus not, but that they keep because they make money from it. You know, bar bas mitzvahs, weddings. It seems that other denominations, anything that chuppah, a bris, anything that brings in to the shul's coffers, that they're very makbid on. But the truth is, the Haftara, unlike the leining that we discussed, Ezra HaSofer, his background in its creation, Moshe Rabbeinu that even preceded him, the obligation to read from the Torah 3 times a week and on Shabbos in the morning and mincha and on Yom Tov. Haftara, we don't have that. Haftara, in fact, is a mystery. So, if I were to ask you, it's more of an intimate crowd tonight, so I think I could ask this. You could unmute yourself. What is the reason for the Haftara? I mean, we are reading from the Torah itself. The idea that we have a reading from neviim and ksuvim is very strange. So why do we do it? Does anybody know? I'll ask another question too.
We were persecuted.
What in the world does Haftara mean?
We prevented from
weird,
learning
strange
Torah,
word. Haftara.
Why are we reading it now more?
Sounds like you're cutting a Torah in half.
Why are we reading it now? That's the question.
So those are my 2 questions I want to discuss tonight, and a third if we have time. So does anybody have a suggestion? Does anybody want to tell me why we read from the Haftara? Where does it come from? What's the source?
Well, we know where it comes from, but we're reading it.
That's not what I asked.
No one's unmuting themselves.
Okay.
I'll tell you.
It came from a time
generally speaking, if you ask this question, you'll get silence, but some people may want to answer. And the most common answer one hears is that there was a period of time that we were not allowed to read from the Torah. And during that time of absence from the Torah, we chose to find something in neviim ksuvim that relates to what we would have leined that Shabbos. We can't lein, let's say, I don't know, Parshas Noach publicly. We'll find something that describes the main Noach or describes another flood, or Shabbos Shira. By Beshalach, you have Shiras Devara, so it reflects a little bit of the parsha. And that's the general explanation that's given. You give it a little bit of thought, and the Chofetz Chaim does give such a interpretation. There was a diktat not to lein, and we chose something for the public setting. He's not the only one who gives this view. Again, it is a popular view. The Avuderahm was a very important Rishon medieval commentator whose commentary on the Siddur it's the Rashi to the Siddur. If ever you hear a rabbi quote the Avuderahm, most likely it's something about the Siddur or davening, but you'll hear me quoted often talking about the Siddur. He is one of the most, if not the most, important commentary to the Siddur. So he gives the exact same interpretation. He lived around 1350. The question, however, is
one word.
It always bothered me. If it was the time of shmad and they didn't allow us to lein from the Torah, they let us lein from Sefer Yehoshua, they let us lein from Malachim, from Yeshayahu, from Hosea, from Micha, from Esther. It seems there has to be some background here. So, and again, already we're getting a sense this is a mystery. I mean, we don't have a direct contemporaneous source as to the birth of Haftara. So this is one interpretation. Let's explain that one interpretation. So the Tosfos Yom Tov. Tosfos Yom Tov was written by Rav Gershon Shol Yom Tov Lipman Heller. He died in 1654. So the very same year that the first group of Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, New York City, was when he was nifter. I don't know if that shows how old he is or how long we've been in this great country. So he says that this decree actually took place during the epoch of a certain individual whose name we mentioned from time to time, Yochanan kohein gadol, right? Yochanan kohein gadol, the story of Hanukkah. So it seems that Antioches, one of the decrees, at least according to this version of events, one of the decrees that was formulated against the Jews was they couldn't read the Torah publicly. Now, we already know that the story of Hanukkah, I recently wrote, I mentioned this in Shul, I would never have asked to have written this. The Jewish press called me and said, would you write an article? So it's been a long time since they asked me, so I was honored. What do you want me to write about? The halachas of Siamese twins, heart transplantation halacha. They say, no, we want you to write about Whoopi Goldberg and what she said on The View about the Holocaust. So what I did, at first I said I wasn't going to do it, but then I decided I'll do it anyway. And in it, I pointed out that, depending throughout our long exile, depending on our enemy, they chose either to view us as a race, if that served their needs. That was Hitler Yamach Shemam's policy. He'll go back to great-grandparents if there was an inkling of Jewish blood. Even if you weren't halachically Jewish, you could be killed. On the other hand, the Hashmonaim looked at us not as a race, but as a religion. They didn't care really that we kept the Torah. I don't know of any source other than the dreidel myth of us not being allowed to learn Torah during the story of Hanukkah. This is really the only source so we already know they did weird things. We know about Shabbos, we know about Rosh Chodesh, we know about Bris Milah. They had this interesting tact that if they would attack in that three-prong approach, Judaism would collapse on itself. Shabbos maybe represents community, Rosh Chodesh represents our relationship with earth and our surroundings, and Bris Milah is family, who knows why. So now I could understand a little bit better the Hellenists and the Syrian Greeks had this philosophy of how to counter our religion, and maybe they felt that if they had us focus on the neviim ksuvim and not the Torah, that would be enough, perhaps. But that's fascinating. So the story of Hanukkah was the birth of the Haftarah. Okay, so you have the Chaim says this, the Avuderahm says this, and Rabbi Yom Tov Flipman Heller gives us that basic background. So just before I go on to other reasons behind the Haftarah, during COVID, because of all the Haftarah questions without a minyan that came up, I started to do digging. Could we find any earlier source? Could we trace this? Could we really trace this being the source? So interestingly, this particular history is first recorded in a sefer called Sefer HaTishbi. Sefer HaTishbi is a very old sefer, and it's a book, a compendium of 712 Halachic and Aramaic terms. It's almost like a first Jewish encyclopedia. It was written by Rav Eliyahu Bachur. A very interesting story behind him. If you're interested in history, Rav Eliyahu Bachur was one of the first to have a last name. So his last name was either Tishbi, after the book that he wrote. He was also given the last name Ashkenazi, because remember, last names are somewhat recent, and he was from the earlier ones. So they developed almost organically. The name Bachur he got because, if I'm not mistaken, he was the eldest. He was the youngest of 9 boys. And he wrote a sefer called HaBachur, and ironically, even though he was the youngest, people called him the Bachur, the eldest. Anyway, I think that's interesting. But so that's probably the earliest source for this. So for some reason, we never stopped reading neviim. After the Hashmonaim were victorious, I guess, sort of, and the Syrian Greeks left, eventually we were allowed to read from the Torah again, but it was probably about 100 years or more that we started reading from the neviim, and we said, let's continue the mincha. That's it. That's the source of the Haftarah. Let's see if there are other sources for this. I'll give you, just looking at my notes and time-wise, I'll give you 4 other sources that I discovered, meaning that's the most famous source, but that's by no means the only source of the Haftarah. So here are 4 other sources. The Rid, The Rid, of course, was from the early Rishonim, very important commentary. So the Rid, he argues that our reading of the Haftarah is no different than our reading from the Torah itself. In that, just like the reading of the Torah itself dates back as far as Ezra, now the institution goes back to Moshe, but the way we divide it and how many aliyos and how many psukim per aliyos goes back to the days of Tanakh to Ezra, so too does this go back to Ezra. Now, he doesn't explain why Ezra instituted it. You have to remember Ezra, both Ezra and Nehemiah, hold on one second, I apologize, I have an ant on my computer. Both Ezra and Nehemiah lived at a very precarious time in Jewish history. The Jews, because of the Persians, were granted permission to return to Eretz Yisrael. Not many of them did, and those that did weren't so religious. They had to introduce them to Shabbos and to Rosh Hashanah and to Yom Kippur. It was a great moment of Kiruv. That's when Nehemiah, we spoke about this last year in our 3-4 classes on the laws of Muktzah. That's when Nehemiah invented the concept of Muktzah. Muktzah doesn't exist anywhere. He said, how do I remind people that it's Shabbos? Because especially those that don't work all week, maybe they're very wealthy, they don't work all week. So how is Shabbos different than any other day? They don't cook during the week. Someone else cooks when they don't cook on Shabbos. You know, they don't ride a horse during the week. They don't ride on Shabbos. So he invented this concept called Muktzah. And although the Muktzah that we have is different, it comes from Nehemiah, we just lightened it. Because after Nehemiah was successful, the Gemara says, okay, we don't have to keep it as strictly as Nehemiah did. We could lighten it. It used to be that Muktzah was an opt-in, not an opt-out. Meaning, if whatever you wanted to use on Shabbos, besides clothing and food, you would have to go around like, okay, I plan on using this sefer, I plan on using this chair. You would go around touching everything, and that's what made it non-Muktzah. And that, you know, you will never forget that it's Shabbos coming. What the rabbis did, they said, let's keep Muktzah, but have it an opt-out, meaning we assume everything in your house you plan on using for Shabbos, unless it's one of 3 or 4 categories of things that we will assume for you, you were never planning on moving on Shabbos. It might be something that you can't use because it's forbidden, like remote control. It might be a Monet painting that you never were planning on touching. So we assume that's Muktzah. Anyway, so it's not surprising to me that there is an opinion that says that the Haftarah dates back to the Second Temple, beginning of the Second Temple time. This was a time that new gezeiros were really, for lack of a better term, were flourishing. So that's the second reason. Again, we don't know why, but it goes back to Ezra. So we have, what do we have here? We have the story of Hanukkah, and then we have about 200, 300 years earlier at the birth of the second Beis HaMikdash. So it's even older. You know, just by the way, what's fascinating, if the Rid is correct, that we started reading from Tanakh before Tanakh was completed. Something interesting to think about. Tanakh wasn't closed yet. Ezra finished Divrei Hayamim. That had to happen. So before the canon was closed, we were reading from it on Shabbos. Okay.
Wow.
Opinion number 3 comes from Reb Hai. Reb Hai lived in the Dark Ages. We always say the Goyim call it the Dark Ages because religion didn't spread yet. Islam wasn't invented yet. Catholicism didn't metastasize. So you had a world that was very dark. They believed in crazy things, witches and potions, and it was non-scientific. So the term the Dark Ages, we should recognize for us, it was not dark. It was very bright. It was the Gaonic era. So as a Jew, don't call it the Dark Ages. Call it the Gaonic era. There's nothing wrong. We're allowed to have a culture. American Indians have a culture. As Jews, we can have a culture. We could call something by our own name. So during the Kufas HaGaonim, Reb Hai Gaon, one of the leading sages in the Gaonic era, and I'll tell you a quick story about what I just said. I must have shared this story before, but I spent about 6 months in the Meir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and I had a chavrusa of mine, Shlomi Mermelstein, and we used to learn together night seder under the stairwell in the dorm. So Meir Yeshiva has 10,000 students, maybe only 300 beds. So you get your own apartment, but the best of the best, they are from the 300 students who actually get a dorm room. So we were learning under there, and one of the students from the best of the best is coming out of his room. We couldn't believe him. Like, what are you always in the base medrash 20 hours a day? What are you doing here? It's only, 10 o'clock at night. So he said he had to write a letter to his lawyer because he got a speeding ticket when he was in America for Pesach. So he turns to us, maybe you could help me. What's the date? So he said, it's May 27th. He goes, no, not the date of the month. What year is it? And we started to laugh. You don't know what year it is. Whatever year it was, 1998, 2000, and whatever. I don't remember, but we thought that was the most bizarre thing. And we went back to learning, and then I picked my head up and I looked at my chavros and I say, tell me, what's the Jewish year? And he had to think and he wasn't sure. I said, so who's the joke on? Us that knows how many years it is from Christ, but don't know our own calculation, or him?
Right.
Anyway, he called it the Gaonic era, not the Dark Ages. So Reb Hai Gaon, he died in 1038. So we're at the end of the Gaonic Dark Ages, certainly the end of the Gaonic era. Now you have Rashi and the Rishonim. So he writes, and very authoritatively, anything Reb Hai Gaon writes is authoritative. He writes, Halacha zu, I'm quoting him. This is found in the Otar Gaonim to Masechtas Megilla, siman 106. He writes, Halacha zu shel Haftara. This halacha of reading the Haftara on Shabbos, Yerusha miyamais haneviim. He takes it back likely even further than Ezra. It was a takana, it was an established law from the days of the prophets. So this could go back to Yehoshua, to Shmuel Hanavi, to Amos, to Tzefania. We don't know exactly when. So it seems like with each opinion we're seeing, it's moving back. So it starts with the Chofetz Chaim that it goes back to mid-Second Temple era, to other opinions that it goes back to Ezra, right before the Second Temple, until now we get into, it might have preceded the First Temple. This is also the view of Rabbi Shaya Detrani. Rabbi Detrani died in 1250. He has a sefer called Sefer HaMachriya. He writes the same thing. Okay, that's opinion number 3.
You don't have to answer the phone. Just thing.
Opinion number 4 comes from Rashi.
Huh?
The guy from Maine.
Now we're getting to real authoritative voices that we all are familiar with. So Rashi says, I want to know where the Haftara comes from. He says something fascinating. And I'll tell you the truth. If somebody is a Baal Tshuva or a ger or a convert, and we say this often, they often have the purest understanding of what's happening. The best, I would advise everybody to have a newly minted Jew at the Shabbos table, or someone who's coming back to Judaism, because they'll see things like Yisro with the Shoftim. They'll see things that you'll miss. If a Baal Tshuva comes to shul for the first time and you explain to him leining, and then the Haftara happens, and you say you don't know what the source is, I bet that he would guess the source that Rashi says. It's very logical. And what all Rashi says is very simple. Rashi says that is really, he posits this. I don't know if Rashi says this as a fact, but he posits that we're all very busy. We have very busy work lives, and we don't have time to learn neviim. Many people could go through life never learning neviim and ksuvim. So on Shabbos and Yom Tov, however, people have extra time. So we started to teach this publicly through reading of the Haftara. The whole point of the Haftara is a hechatimtza. It's a pretext. It's an excuse. It's a trick to get us to know neviim. And by the way, it's great advice. People learn the parsha that they should every week. I would advise to also learn the Haftara if you can't do it every week. I always, even if it makes no sense, end my drasha with a pasuk from the Haftara. I always do it because I always feel bad that the Haftara is there, and sometimes the whole drasha is about the Haftara. But the Haftara is so beautiful. No matter what topic you're talking about, simcha, you're talking about whatever the topic is. What was the topic this past week? I don't remember. I think it was about tefillah. But you could always find your source in the Haftara. But that's the reason why. And my advice is, if you would read through the Haftara once a week, you're going to be far more proficient in Nach. Because not only will it review certain chapters of Neviim for you, you'll find yourself, you open up the Haftara and you're in the middle of a story. So you may have to go back a few chapters and skim what happens before, what happens afterwards. It's good advice. But Rashi says that's it. That's the whole reason we do it. And based on this Rashi, it's very interesting. Have you ever noticed, this is so fascinating. Speaking of Haftara Musaf, what we're learning now, have you ever noticed something so interesting? The most important part, or one of the most important parts of davening every day is at the end of davening saying Ashrei again and Uvalat Zion. It always bothered me that women and most girls' schools, whether it's Stern or Beis Yaakov, don't push girls to say Uvalat Zion at the end of davening. The Gemara tells us that Kedusha, the Siddur, this Kedusha that we say, what we call Uvalat Zion, is one of the 2-3 things that keep us alive in Gullus. I don't know why women don't do it. They should, but not that they should, that they have to. I mean, it will be good for the Jews. But that's a major feature. So, for example, the halacha is you're not supposed to take up your tefillin before you say Asher Uvalat Zion. Everybody's rushing. I'm sure I told you the story. One of my yeshivas, Rav Dovid Kaplan, was once visiting someone in prison. And it's one of these prisons that Nebuch has a lot of Jews in them. They have like 2 daf yomis, a Yerushalmi yomi, a nach yomi, a beis medrash, a kailo. They have everything you need, sadly. I mean, it's good that they have it, but it's bad that they need it. Anyway, he went to visit a friend, and the friend says, "Oh, why don't you just come for shachris?" So he brought his talis and his tefillin, Mersha Shiva, and he davened shachris in the prison. By the end of davening, by Ashrei Uvalat Zion, he saw a group on the back table, and they were taking up the talis and tefillin already. So my Shiva he said to them, he goes, what's one thing me, when I'm davening in Zichron Shneir in Toronto, that I take off my talis and tefillin before davening is over. But you, where are you even going? Where are you rushing to? You have nowhere to go. You're literally in prison. So halacha always understood that we have this temptation to take up, but Ashrei Uvalat Zion, you don't take it off. You try not to unless you have to before that. So why is it then, if this tefillah is so important, why don't we do it on Shabbos? During the week, on Monday and Thursday, after you lein, we put away the Torah and we say Asher Uvalat Zion. Now we do it by mincha on Shabbos, but we don't do it after shachris before Musaf like we do during the week. In fact, even when you lein on, Rosh Chodesh and you have a Musaf, because maybe you think it's Musaf. So on a Tuesday, if it's Rosh Chodesh, you daven shachris, you say Hallel, we lein, we put away the Torah, then we say Ashrei and Uvalat Zion, and then we daven Musaf. So why don't we do that on Shabbos? So the poskim explain this is why understanding the reasons for things open up the doors to understand many other things. So based on this Rashi, that the reason why we read neviim is just to learn it, it's an opportunity, people are paying attention. That's why there's no Ashrei Uvalat Zion on Shabbos morning, because the whole beauty of Uvalat Zion, what makes it special, is that you're reading from the neviim and you're translating it. If you ever looked at Uvalat Zion, the major feature is saying Kadosh, Kadosh, Baruch, and translating those psukim from the neviim. That's what makes it so special. In fact, the Gemara says, because it combines tefillah and Torah learning. But since by learning Navi and based on Rashi, the whole reason is so that we learn Navi, there's no reason to say Uvalat Zion. Fascinating. Now, for spiritual reasons, we don't want to go through a day without saying it, so we start mincha with it. So that's reason number 4 for Haftarah. Just before we go on, let's just review the Chofetz Chaim. In days of the Chashmonaim, they didn't allow us to read from the Torah publicly. We chose a parsha that's similar, and that's why it's always similar. Reason number 2, it was from the days of Ezra, which makes sense because when we came back to Israel to build the second temple, many of us were not so religious. Reason number 3 was sort of like reason number 2, but it doesn't go back to Ezra. It actually was earlier neviim. And reason number 4, Rashi, he doesn't give us a date when it began, but at some point in history, it could have went back all the way to Yoshua. It could have started with Rabbi Akiva. We don't know. We realize that people are so busy with work. We don't want them to forget about neviim, so we started to choose neviim for each parsha, and we still try to find navi that's similar to the parsha. Reason number 5. So one of the great gaonim of the last generation, his name is Reuben Margolius. I quote him quite frequently. He was a tremendous genius, and he was a rare genius that he was a prolific writer, but he would write very tersely. His svarim are just a handful of pages, and it could take you months to read. Brilliant. He was a Rav in Tel Aviv, but he was known. He received the Israel Prize, so he was known by the Dati Leumi world. by the Haredi world, by the Hasidic world, really a unique figure in modern Jewish history. So he's also a great historian, Halachic historian. He records yet another history to the Haftarah. So he quotes a medrash. And the medrash states, this is, if you want to look it up, it's a medrash Tanchuma in the beginning to Parshas Re'eh. And Rav Margolius quotes, and the medrash says like this: "Achaitim shel Yisrael, the sinners of Bnei Yisrael, Amru, they say, Haneviim v'haksuvim heim lo Torahim. They're not Torah. Yeah, we have these books of prophets, we have these books of writing, but they're not Torah. V'lo ma'amin bahem, and they don't believe in them. Meaning, the sinners say, I accept the 5 books of Moses, but what do I care what Yirmiyahu said? I mean, there's truth in a sense that once Moshe died and Yeshua and the Torah was closed, that the Torah was only given once, right? And anything in Navi, if you know enough, you could find in Chumash. But the idea that we have nothing to gain on our level from the neviim is very dangerous. And they stated, the Medrash continues, what are these chaitim oimrim? I'll read it to English. And have we not obeyed the voice of Hashem our God by walking in his Torah alone, which he set before us at the hand of his servants? So Rabbi Margolius quotes this and says this was a reference to the Tzedukim. They weren't just knocking neviim and ksuvim, they were knocking any rabbi. They said, all we need is the Torah. I don't know how they understood what totafos are. From totafos, you don't get black boxes with a ledge, with a shin and 4 parshias. I don't understand what they do with shechita. Right? The Torah says you should slaughter animals kasher tzivisicha, like I commanded you, but yet not one command is in the Torah. Clearly, there's a Torah Shabbal Peh, but that's who was referring to. So in order to combat such a dangerous belief, so what Rav Margolius is teaching us that we didn't know, we all heard of the Tzedukim, those that didn't believe in the oral tradition or the rabbinic tradition, that we always knew. But what this Medrash tells us or reminds us, they also had trouble believing in neviim, meaning anybody after Moshe and Yoshua. So in order to combat that element, that very dangerous belief, we began to read from the neviim in conjunction with the Torah. Meaning we could have just said, you have to read from Navi every Tuesday at 3:00. It wouldn't have worked. We had to get them in the moment when they're in shul, so Shabbos morning, and we had to connect it to Torah reading to show that it can't be that bad if we're reading it next to the time that we're reading from the Torah. So there we have 5, 6, 7 different reasons for why we read the Haftarah. So
the rabbi who
it's already 9:00.
Who's the person?
We'll continue for a few minutes now, because there are still other elements we didn't explain yet. Now we already, I think, last week explained that especially if you take the Chofetz Chaim's view that the Haftarah is to represent the parsha that we couldn't lein, the following halacha makes sense, and you'll tell me if I taught this to you already, but it's worth repeating. Just like an aliyah can't be less than 3 psukim, so too Haftarah has a number. A Haftarah on Shabbos can't be less than 21 psukim. A Haftarah on Yom Tov can't be less than 15 psukim. A Haftarah on Yom Kippur can't be less than 25 psukim. No, 30, no. Hold on 1 second. What's 7 times 5?
35.
No, sorry, what's 5 times 3? 15. What's 6 times 3? 18. I can't be less than 18 psukim. So I'll explain to you what this means. Because since on Shabbos, we're supposed to read from the Torah, and the Torah is 7 aliyos, and Ezra said each aliyah needs 3 psukim. That means a parsha from the Torah that we read on Shabbos has to be at least how many psukim?
21.
No.
21.
3 psukim to every aliyah, and there's 7 aliyos. What's the minimum length of any parsha?
21.
Anyone?
21.
Well, I'm not telling you. Someone has to speak up.
He doesn't hear you.
21.
If there are 7 aliyos, and there are at least 3 psukim to every aliyah,
He doesn't hear anything.
what's the minimum number of psukim that we read on a Shabbos morning?
21. Why?
Oh, am I muted?
Yes.
I was muted this whole time.
That's why you didn't hear me before.
You know, I was wondering, why is everybody so silent? You know, it's funny. I'm sure someone said 21. And I apologize if you guys were saying other things throughout this year. funny. I teach in one of the places I teach over Zoom is to girls in Rochester High School. And I dread it because they put me up on the big screen in the class and the girls look like they're like 24,000 feet under the seat. And there's no dialogue between us. First of all, they're young ladies, 16, 17, they're shy. They're not gonna. So I lose my voice. I just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So tonight I was thinking, this is like one of my classes in Rochester. Everybody's so quiet, but it was on mute. I'm so sorry. So 21. So that's going to be the minimum for Shabbos, because Shabbos Haftara, because the Haftara is supposed to represent the Torah reading. And on Yom Tov, when you have 5 aliyahs and 5 times 3 is 15, Haftarahs be 15 psukim, and on Yom Kippur 18, and so on and so forth. So everything fits. But there's one question we have to ask, and it's such an obvious question, and maybe you've thought about it. I don't think I've ever spoken about it. Maybe I have. Why is it by a yard site we want to get maftir, or for a woman we want someone in the family to get maftir? And also, what's the term Haftorah? What does that even mean? So let's ask. Someone showed me a book, the Haftorah cycle. Okay.
It's an excellent book, Rabbi. It gives each parsha each week in depth how it's related to the parsha.
Were you trying to say this before when you?
Yes, and you were muted, and I couldn't get a word in.
You know, so let me end this year in a couple of minutes. Let me say 2 things. Next week, I'm going to discuss. We're going to get to Musaf, but we're going to open with the translation of the term Haftorah, a very weird word, and why, if this is the history, so murky, why do we focus on it so much? Why is this what Avelim tried to get, or someone in their family tried to get? How does this equal an aliyas neshama? It's a very important question. We're also going to discuss, based on the history that we just gave, what is with all these brachos? All brachos before, brachos afterwards. This bracha, we switch it for Yom Tov. What other mitzvahs? This many brachos. We don't even know why we're doing it, and we have all these brachos. What's going on? It's an important question. We're also going to discuss some other choice questions about choosing haftorahs throughout the year. Very, very interesting, I think. So I'm not trying to tease it. We just only have a few minutes. I don't have time to get into it. I want to. I will say one view of the word haftorah comes from the word patur. It's to demonstrate that we are now relieved of our duty of reading from the Torah. We had to read from the Torah and have 7 aliyos. This is the haftorah. This is once I'm patur. Once I relieved myself from that obligation, now we could start do other things. That's also why you're not allowed to read a haftorah unless you read from the Torah itself. You can't, if you don't have a Sefer Torah, just read the haftorah. You can't do that. It could only come after a reading of the Torah. So, and we'll get to Musaf as well next week. But I want to just end with a story. There's a camp called Camp Harim. Now, there are several camps in the mountains that are yeshiva camps, meaning there are certain yeshivas, most yeshivas, the style that I went to, you only get off in the summer 3 weeks. That's it. You get off 3 weeks in the summer, 2.5 weeks by Sukkot, and 2.5 weeks by Pesach. That's the rest of the year you're in yeshiva. That's the typical Haredi schedule, or ultra Haredi maybe schedule. But many yeshivos like Long Beach and Nava Mintz and other yeshivos, Montreal, they think it's too much for the boys. And for the first month of the summer, instead of being in yeshiva like I was, they would go to the mountains. And Camp Harim was one of these yeshiva camps where the whole yeshiva and their base medrash would move to the mountains. So it was still a regular yeshiva schedule, except, you had 3-4 hours a day to play sports. Right? There was no color war or night activity. There was night seder. But, from let's say 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, you could have some fun. Okay. It's called the yeshiva camp. There's Orshraga was one. My yeshiva high school and from Toronto, we once went to Orshraga. They let us in one summer. They never let us back. We were there for 1 month. Oh boy, we snuck in fireworks. Maybe I shouldn't tell you all the stories all the things that we did that summer, but we never were invited back. But anyway, so one summer I went to Camp Harim for a Shabbos because my brother, his father-in-law owns the camp. So he started that camp, and very famous yeshivas have been going there for decades. Anyway, so I went there for a Shabbos, And I was single at the time, I believe. Nechama's on, she could correct me, but I think I was single at the time. And I went, to choose what base medrash do you want to go to? It's a huge camp. So I went to the Long Beach Yeshiva base medrash. So you walk into the Long Beach Yeshiva base medrash. It's like walking into Long Beach. There were yeshivas there. Zecher Tzadik, the Kodesh Lebrocha, Rav Fegelstock, who was nifter last summer. Wow, what a special individual he was. What a special individual he was. Anyway, so after Kabbalah Shabbos, a beautiful yeshiva singing Kabbalah Shabbos, and afterwards you wait in line and you say Good Shabbos to the Rosh Yeshiva. So I stand in line and I look, and on the side of the base medrash was a guy. And I should point out, it was the middle of the 3 weeks. There was a guy, he was leaning on a stender like Joe Cool, like the Marlboro Man. His beard was trimmed, so clearly he didn't care that it was the 3 weeks. You're in yeshiva, you're not working, there's no reason to trim. And looked like he had a fresh haircut all around. And he was leaning on the stender while the whole yeshiva. You don't leave a base medrash without saying Good Shabbos when you're in yeshiva. You don't leave until you say Good Shabbos to the Rosh Yeshiva. And I wasn't concentrating on this guy. I just had this fleeting thought. This guy, I know this guy. I got this guy down to a T. He's Mr. Cool. He's too cool for school. As I'm leaving the base medrash, I meet a friend of mine. His name is Yossi from Toronto, who was learning in Long Beach at the time. And I made a comment. Look at Joe Cool over there. He doesn't go around and he trims his beard during 3 weeks. He says, what are you talking about? He says, that's so-and-so. He's on chemo. And we thought he wasn't going to come for the summer, but he's able to come for Shabbosim. That's why he's losing hair in all these weird places. And he didn't go around because he has no energy. The Adarabba, the fact that he stood up just when the Shiva was standing, that was his kavod. And I realized that being done l'kaf schos, judging people favorably, goes to an extreme. So why do I say this? Is that I hope none of us should ever have to go through chemo, and none of us should ever have to be sick. But I hope tonight, when people were asking questions and it seemed like I was ignoring you, you were done l'kaf schos. And I should have been done l'kaf schos, everybody being quiet. There must be a reason that I must have been muted. So I thank you for judging me favorably. I am sorry if I didn't hear anybody. And we'll continue. It's 9:10, nice 40-minute share. We'll continue next week with Haftara, and we'll move on, thankfully, to putting the Torah away. Not so simple. The rabbi's drasha, which is a very exciting discussion. What's this idea of a rabbi speaking in the middle of davening? Where did that come from? It's actually very interesting. And of course, Musaf and Kiddush and napping and Shalashudis and Havdalah. Until then, have a good week, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's